Yep, so today we'll be reviewing the data migration tool, and this can be used to migrate data upstream or downstream, which we'll get into. But first, I do want to review the agenda. Basically, I want to review the challenges that I've heard from many customers. Majority of these overlap, and everyone with Salesforce data migrations usually experience similar pain points. Second, I want to get into is the use cases, why you would migrate upstream or why you would migrate downstream. And then we'll get right into the demo. And then just to summarize, we'll talk about best practices and then really discussion. What you thought about the demo, what your pain points are, and what you want to see in other data migration tools that we could enhance. So moving on, the top challenges with data migration in Salesforce, number 1 and 2 really overlap. Just understanding the time and resources it takes and then poor planning. When I was developing within our Salesforce project, we would always underestimate how long it takes to do data migrations. You always have issues with field level security, relationships, bad data, duplicate records, and we would always underestimate how many points it would take per sprint. The third challenge is the complexity of the data. Usually the end user, they need to be responsible for figuring out the external IDs, the relationships, the hierarchy between the data objects, and that, again, takes time. It's trial and error. You're going to have failed deployments with your first time. The fourth one being, which I've fallen victim to, is reviewing your active process builders, flows, workflow rules, triggers, validation rules upon entering in new data. This is great. So if you're in a dummy sandbox and you migrate new data, if you don't have those workflow rules turned off, maybe your business users get 50,000 rogue emails and you have to go send them all emails saying that was an accident, sorry. And the fifth is just migrating data upstream or downstream. Each environment, in the perfect world, all your orgs are being in sync. But the reality is that takes time. And that's the harsh reality is sometimes your sandboxes are really out of sync with QA or production. So moving on to the use cases, there are really 2 main use cases for our data migration. The first one being is sandbox seeding. So in the real world, a use case for this is, let's just say there's a bug found in production. Developers or admins want real data to test with, so they'd see their sandboxes with a subset of data, which is legitimate and not just dummy records, so they can test their configuration or development. Then there's upstream migration, which is usually taking it from a dev sandbox to test all the way to production. Use cases for this would be like CPQ components, where configuration, they're stored as records, so not metadata, actually data, and then Encino components alike. But within Flosum's data migration tool, it's really installed in your source org. So if you wanted to move data from a staging sandbox down to a developer, you could, or you can move it developer all the way to production if desired. The option is yours. You just need to have the right permissions to do so, and I have to emphasize that. So without further ado, I'm going to hop into the demo. And throughout this demo, if you have any questions, how I got there, any objections, please interrupt me. Really, this is your time, and I want to let everyone have a solid understanding of the pros and how this can save you a ton of time within Flosum's data migration. So switching to the data migration, as I mentioned, this would be installed in your source org where you want to move data from. It does not need to be installed in your target org. You would set up your target org over in the settings tab, which is basically just OAuth authentication. Still following Flosum's security architecture, this is going to be installed in your org. Flosum has 0 access to it. We don't have access to your data. This is not leaving your Salesforce firewall. So this is not hitting some third-party server where your data is going to be exposed. You solely own this. But first thing I like to do upon logging into data migration is, one, beforehand, a prerequisite is know what you want to migrate. Know that criteria, the objects you want to migrate, and Flosum will handle pretty much everything else for you. So for this example here, I already have an account data set built out, but just know if I click new or edit, it's the exact same page layout, exact same process. So if I click edit here, the hard requirement for creating a data set is, one, give this a unique name, something you're probably going to remember, and then select your object. What fields and data do you want to pull the object from? So in this use case, I'll use the account object. Scroll on a bit further, and once this object is loaded, you're going to see a list of all the available fields. So in this use case, if you think the billing country isn't relevant and you don't want to migrate that, you can simply remove it. The cool thing about this too is you can actually mask the data. So if you're doing sandbox seeding, and let's just say that annual revenue, for example, is sensitive data or PII, if you don't want developers to have real access to that data, you can simply double click and mask it. And what the masking will do is it's going to take a random value from your library. So maybe annual revenue was $1 million in production. When you migrate this down, it might come through as $250,000. So still legitimate, just random values. The next is going to be your key set information. This is only going to be useful if you're doing upserts. So you could define that key set field. Ideally, it'd have to be unique where you want to upsert those records. One thing to note is if Flosum does not find that record to upsert, we're just going to skip it. Nothing's going to happen. We're not going to automatically insert it. But majority of developers and admins, they just want to do inserts. So if that's the case, first thing you can do is you can define how many records you want migrated for each object. So in this use case, maybe I want 1,500 account records in my sandbox. Next, your declarative filters are going to be great for admins. You can think of this almost like building a report. So you could say, billing city equals Denver, which I always use. And then down below here, you can add your filter logic, which would be your and/or statements. If you're a developer, you probably love your SOQL filters. So if you click on this tab here, you're absolutely free to write your where clause. One thing to note is you can cross-reference objects here. So maybe you only want cases related to this account. You could specify this here. And of course, check your syntax to make sure everything's written correctly and that query is going to execute as expected. Yeah, so once your data sets are built out, and again, this is just one data set. Ideally, if you want to migrate cases, contacts, assets with it, you'd ideally build those out beforehand. So here, if you save it, I'll say cancel, it takes me back to the data sets. The next in line is build out your sequences. And this, from personal experience, is one of the biggest pain points along data migrations. Figuring out the relationships, what order the parent-child objects can be migrated in order to keep those relationships in your target org. Again, even if I click new here or edit, same exact page layout. But when I click edit or new, you'll see in the top corner or top of the screen, Flosum is actually going to be analyzing your source org. And really what we're doing is figuring out those relationships and external IDs on the back end so you don't need to worry about it. So really taking the headache away from the end user. So here within my sequence, you can see I've already added 7 data sets. If you come in here and you're like, well, maybe I need to add a little bit more to this because this is not what I want to migrate, you can add parent-child relationships. So for example, if I want to add a child object to this contact, you click on this purple, might be blue, I'm bad with colors. You click on this, and here's a list of all your child objects. So I'm going to click these at random, and we can see where these are placed in the sequence. So I can pick social persona. Let's pick feed item. And then we'll do, let's do case. So you can see that even though contact was 4th in the sequence, Flosum automatically added these 3 data sets or objects as 6th, 7th, and 8th, just because we understand the relationships on the back end. Piggybacking off that, if you want to add a parent object, you can click on this orange button, and we can add lead, for example. And you'll see that lead automatically jumps to 4th in the sequence, just because we understand. Now, these yellow buttons, these would be child overlay steps. So basically, as you add these data sets, this contact is going to pull all records. But if you want this contact to only pull records that are related to this account, you could specify using this yellow button. So once this is done and you're looking at these data sets and objects, and you're thinking, okay, this is what I want to migrate. The next logical step is to test your migration. How many records will be migrated? Are there going to be any failures? And how much space is going to be required for a Scratch org or developer sandbox? So for this use case, I'll just cancel out of here, and we'll go back to the sequence. Click on that standard objects migration, the same we built that out for, and we can do a view record count. And think of this really as a dry run. I'll leave all of these blank for now and just create. And then in my source org, I only have about 150 records, so this should be lightning quick. So down here, that test migration would have been complete. And if you scroll up, you can see that only 126 records would be migrated per my criteria. And that's easily enough space to fit a Scratch org or Dev Sandbox. Down below here, you can see how many records we processed for each object. And with 0 failures, I can pretty much ensure that my deployment would be successful the first go around. One thing to note about before migration, if you have any duplicate records or field level security, like if you don't create or write access to those fields, Flosum is going to flag it. You'll be prompted to resolve those before the migration actually kicks off. The next step after looking at this, and again, you think, okay, the 126 records, that looks like I want to migrate. That's right, is optional. The next step is optional, but it is recommended if you do have those workflow rules or triggers that are going to fire off, we can actually set up our target org and disable them. So again, under that same sequence, we can set up that target org. And here we can cherry pick for what objects we want to disable these for. So maybe my contact just has a ton of triggers and I don't want that firing off. You could just disable the triggers for that object, or you could select them all and disable everything. That is a case-by-case basis and ultimately up to the end user there. But once you disable these in your target org and that completes, really the next logical step is to either schedule a migration or do a manual migration. So over here in the sequences, yet again, we can schedule a migration or do it manually. The one thing to note about these templates that you build out, they are reusable. You can clone them and you can edit them at any given point in time. So really the heavy legwork, I would say, is up front. Once you have this working, any developer, granted you have the right permissions, can come in here and reuse these same templates. So this is the use case for going, this is sandbox scenes. So usually this would be installed in production and you can take this to QA or sandboxes. Then the next use case I want to review is upstream. Let's just say CPQ components. Whether you're migrating downstream, upstream, whatever object it is, create your data sets, add them to a sequence. Now, out of the box, if you do like CPQ or Encino components, we do have out of the box templates for these. So I'm in my CPQ org right now, and I believe it's 72 out of the box. Yeah, because these are all examples. So yeah, it should be 72. You can edit these, clone these, use them as needed. And then over in the sequences tab, I believe out of the box will be a 72-line sequence. So what I always recommend for these, clone that sequence because you have that baseline. You can add, remove these, edit these as needed. So really giving you that velocity and the base, the really template and structure is there for you. Last thing to add is if you ever look at your data sets or you do a successful migration and you look at your target org and you're thinking this data does not look right, it's not what I was expecting, you can always roll back. So there is always that option too. The one thing to know about the rollbacks is unlike release management, where you can roll back to 5 deployments ago if desired, within data migration, you can only roll back to the latest data migration. So ideally that those checks and balances need to be in place after migration. Go in your target org, make sure everything looks right. If it does, great. If not, you can roll it back. But now I'm going to switch to the PowerPoint slide just to review some best practices and then really open the floor to see what you liked, what you didn't like, what your current team experiences with problems. Yep. So 5 of the best practices, and again, I struggled through this when migrating data with other tools and came to Flosum, so I've understood a decent amount of the troubles that most teams have and how we try and resolve them. First one being is identify the data you want to migrate. Very obvious, but usually when I get assigned a user story in a sprint cycle, it's, oh, we need this data migrated. They wouldn't tell me the child objects, what the criteria was, so then you're spending half the work week figuring out what the business wants. Takes time, poor planning. And then create the templates for the data. I would definitely say this goes into planning. Ideally, it is going to take a little bit of time depending on how complex and how many sequences or data sets you have. But the great thing is once you build those out, re-edit them, reuse them. So I would say definitely load up your the beginning of it for time to build out your templates. And after that, it should be smooth sailing ideally. Populate the templates. So for CPQ, they're out of the box, but sometimes you don't want to migrate all those fields or there's criteria for them. So make sure those are correct. And then prep the destination org. If you have triggers, workflow rules, validation rules, whatever it may be, disable them. That's an optional step. If you don't need to, don't do it. And then I would always say this is the biggest one, validate the data. So when you're building out your data sets and sequences, what I always like to do, I like to test 3 at a time. So I'll put 3 data sets in the sequence, test it. Maybe there's field level security issues. I go there and resolve it. That way you're not building out this 20 data set sequence and you're going to get like 500 errors. It's a lot to overcome. Taking little bites at a time and taking this off in chunks, I've found great success with it. That is optional, but I've definitely say number 5 was the biggest advantage, just taking it in little chunks rather than thinking I'm going to have it all right the first time. And then last but not least, really questions for viewers on the phone. I want to hear what your biggest challenges are migrating data in Salesforce. Is it time, complexity, whatever it may be?